everyone. So let's jump into the webinar now that we know what we all wish we were doing, which is eating all the delicious desserts that you all shared. So I wanted to start off the webinar with just talking a little bit about why this topic matters, and Margaret touched on that in her introduction as well. But the FIP Workplan should be the guiding document for the FIP, and it effectively maps out how the FIP will meet its stated objectives. So an effective work plan should address the gaps to improve the fishery performance toward acceptable levels, and so that will vary depending on what the goals of your FIP are. And importantly, an ineffective work plan can often lead to resources and time being spent without a guarantee of needed improvement. So this is one of the reasons why the FisheryProgress team wanted to host this seminar for FIP implementers on this specific topic. So just in taking a look at how FIP work plans are developed, we generally think about three general categories of information that are important when developing a FIP work plan. So the first is using a needs assessment if you're a basic FIP, or an MSc pre-assessment if you're a comprehensive FIP, which will lay out what the deficiencies are in the fishery that need to be addressed. The FIP scoping document outlines the strategies that the fishery might undertake to implement improvements. And so the scoping document is typically not meant to be a prescriptive document, but something that's used with stakeholders to share potential ideas around what the FIP could focus on in terms of action. And then a really critical component of developing the FIP work plan should be getting input from FIP stakeholders, especially from those who are going to be responsible for any of the actions that are in the work plan. And as we go through later on in the seminar, we'll talk more about roles and responsibilities. And so it's really important to, whenever possible, get feedback and input from stakeholders at the beginning of the stages of developing a FIP, so that hopefully that will help ensure that there's the right buy-in and support for the FIP and implementing the various actions that need to be done. And also just one note on the development of a FIP work plan for comprehensive FIPs. There are some criteria that have been defined or outlined by FisheryProgress that lay out what the different requirements are for consultants or others who might be developing work plans for comprehensive FIPs. So just to note that there's sort of an additional requirement there that doesn't exist for basic FIPs. So what we'll do on the seminar today is walk through in more detail some of these essential elements of a FIP work plan. But the first is objectives, or laying out what the FIP is hoping to achieve. FIP actions, FIP tasks, which are optional but recommended. Responsible parties for identifying who will be completing which actions within the work plan. Timeframes and deadlines. Metrics linked to the MSc performance indicators. An associated budget and estimated costs, and we'll talk about this as well later on, but most FIPs do have a separate budget document. It can also be useful to include some of those estimated costs in the work plan itself, so we'll talk through some examples there. And then it can also be useful to include any risks that there might be to achieving the work plan. So looking at the objectives for the FIP, so these should define the near-term scope of the FIP. They should be time-bound, and so include an end date. They should also be measurable, so what will the FIP accomplish by whatever the deadline is. The scope of the objectives should be appropriate for the FIP type. So for example, if you're working on a comprehensive FIP, the objectives should reflect the fact that the overall goal of the FIP is to address all of the performance indicators that are required to bring the fishery up to the level of performance associated with an unconditional pass of the MSc standard. It's recommended that objectives use a maximum time frame of 5 years. And that also it's recommended to link the objectives to specific performance indicators and scoring issues. And this can just help provide some additional structure to objectives and make sure they're very clearly linked to helping the FIP achieve the stated objectives. And so just as a reminder as well, so the objectives for the FIP work plan should be the same as the objectives for the FIP overall, and those are listed on the overview page for the FIP on FisheryProgress. For basic FIPs, talked a little about this on the earlier slide, but the objectives for a basic FIP should just be focused on a specific set of environmental challenges that have been identified for the fishery, and comprehensive FIPs should have objectives that will address all of the environmental issues that have been identified in the MSC pre-assessment. So based on what we just went through in terms of talking about some of the criteria for objectives, we wanted to walk through just a couple of examples of FIP objectives and get some comments and feedback from all of you around potential ways that these objectives could be improved. So this first one, I'll walk through this first one and then I'll show the additional ones and ask you guys to weigh in. But the first one is just improve management of the fishery. And so our suggested improvements to this one is to be more specific about what aspect of management. So in general, the more specific that you can be when defining the objectives for your FIP, the better. It helps determine whether or not they're measurable and whether or not those objectives have been achieved. And there's also no deadline for the specific objective. So it makes it not measurable. So the next one is meet the MSC standard by 2021. Does anyone have any suggestions or feedback on how this objective could be improved?
Looks like Nicole Beadle says, what part of the MSC standard?
Yep, good point. So be more specific around which aspects of the standard the FIP is working on. Any other comments? The one we added here is just when in 2021. Are we talking about the beginning of the year or the end of the year? So it's good there is a timeline in general, but in general, better to be more specific rather than less. So the next one is demonstrate the fishery does not hinder the recovery of sea turtles by the end of 2019. Are there any suggested improvements to this one? We didn't have any suggested improvements. Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
I guess it'd be good to add something there about how that's going to be measured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Amanda, that was something you flagged when we went through this example as well.
Yeah.
So the last one we have is reducing the environmental impact of the fishery. Any feedback or comments on this one?
All right, Julie, again, I would say the same thing. It's we need to know how you're going to measure reducing environmental impact.
Mm-hmm.
And Mara has a good comment here.
Yeah.
It's missing a specific date, and it's not specific to which environmental impacts you're referring to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are the two major things that we identified as well. And apologies, I can't actually see the chat box, so thank you, Jeremy, for reading those out. All right, so what we wanted to do is, we'll use this template or this form as we walk through the seminar, and so we'll build out this table as we walk through each of the different elements of the table itself. So the first one here, the only component right now, is just the objective itself. So by the end of 2020, demonstrate the fishery's impact on endangered seabirds. And so actually, before I jump to the actions section of the presentation, I wanted to just pause and see if anyone has any questions related to the objectives piece. We do want to make sure that we're taking questions as we go through the presentation. We will also have time at the end. But I just wanted to pause here and see if anyone has any questions or comments on what we've covered so far. Anything in the chat box, or are we okay to move ahead?
I think you're okay to move ahead. Yeah, nothing in the chat box.
All right, great. So I'm looking at FIP actions and what those are. So these are a major activity from the FIP's work plan that must be completed in order to address the deficiencies that have been identified in the needs assessment or the MSC pre-assessment. The actions should be very clearly aligned with the FIP's objectives. Should also be an action goal, which will describe the result of the action. Actions also need to have organizations or specific individuals that have been identified as being responsible for completing that action or the task. They should also include a month and year deadline for completing the action. So a lot of these are very similar to the objectives that need to be in place for the FIP as well. And very importantly, the actions need to be linked to the relevant performance indicators. For those of you who have been reporting on FisheryProgress for some time, you know there is a very clear link between looking at progress of the performance indicators and the actions and tying those two things together. So that's a really important component as well. And so also just wanted to highlight the fact that the way that actions are tracked on FisheryProgress is that they help contribute to this pie chart here, which demonstrates the percentage of actions that are complete versus incomplete. And I think one of the things that the FisheryProgress team has seen is that for some FIPs who might have a lot of tasks and maybe more tasks than actions, that the progress within tasks is not captured here in this pie chart, which is why it's really important to make sure that there are actions outlined for the FIP and what it's going to achieve, because that will also help demonstrate as you're making progress for those actions. That is what will show up here on this slide, or sorry, on this page on your FIP profile. Jeremy or Albert, is there anything else that you wanted to add about that? Did I capture that correctly?
Yes, you did. I just want to also add that having gone through so many work plans myself, it's clear that there is a balance in the number of actions that is practical, probably both on the ground as well as for reporting on FisheryProgress. So if there are too few actions and there's a number of tasks associated with each, it can be difficult to demonstrate progress through the completion of actions, as Jesse just pointed out. And conversely, if there are too many actions, you may find it to be a burden to provide progress updates on all of the actions every 6 months. So that said, I don't want to be prescriptive, but usually between 5 and 10 actions is a good number to shoot for in what you might feel like is not too little and not too many.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So going back to our table here that we'll walk through, so we've added in a couple of specific actions that will help the fishery, help the FIP achieve its objectives. So the first is develop and implement crew training and identification key for seabirds to be repeated annually. The second is implement requirements for recording of seabird interactions in logbooks and collect data. And the third is use data collected during 2019 to assess the likelihood of adverse impact unit of assessment on ETP birds. So these are the specific actions that have been identified related to the objective that we have here around demonstrating the fishery's impact on endangered seabirds. So next, we go to tasks. So again, these are optional, but they are recommended. So these break down the actions into specific steps that will describe how the action is going to be accomplished. This allows FIPs to better demonstrate the progress that you're making, which therefore, as Jeremy just mentioned, can help the reviewer assess whether or not a score may have improved. And so a straightforward way just to think about the difference between actions and tasks is that the actions should describe what the FIP is going to do, and the tasks will describe how the FIP is going to do those things. So we have a couple of examples here. Again, building off of that first action within this work plan. And so the first task is develop identification key for seabirds overlapping in range with the fishery and seabird logbook. And I won't read all of the text here. The second task is to develop crew training on seabird identification. And the third task is to distribute keys and logbook sheets to each vessel. So you can see here how the tasks are explaining the how, whereas the action is what is actually going to be done. So what we wanted to do next is a little bit of an exercise with everyone, just looking at the difference between objectives and actions and tasks. And so we have some text here that I'll pull up on the slide, and I'll also read it for those of you who are not logged into the webinar. And so there's one objective in this text that will pop up, and there are a number of actions and a number of tasks. And so what we want to do is just get your feedback on which ones you think fall into which category. So the first is letter A, following consultation, the fishery manager will revise the draft FMP and take it to the Fisheries Commission for approval and implementation. B, implement a fisheries management plan with explicit short and long-term objectives for sustainable stock management by January 2021. C, the fishery will have explicit long and short-term objectives consistent with MSC's P1 and P2 by January 2024. D, after the first fishing season under the new FMP, the FIP implementer will evaluate the success of the new FMP and provide a report to the fishery manager and industry representatives. E, FIP implementer, fishery manager, and industry representative will draft a fishery management plan for the target stock in consultation with user groups. And F, update the FMP to include ecosystem-related objectives by January 2023. So I'll leave these up on the screen just for a minute or so and let folks read these over, and then we'll start asking for your feedback. Just as a reminder, just think about which of these would be, which one of these things would be the objective, and then which would be the actions and which would be the tasks. And I'll give you a hint, there are 2 actions and 3 tasks. If folks need more time, are you ready to take a guess at which item falls into which category?
Christo in the chat box thinks that B is the objective.
Sorry, did you say B or D?
B as in boy.
B. B as in boy, okay.
Eileen agrees.
Okay, any other suggestions for objectives?
Mara thinks maybe it might be F, and so does Julie.
Okay, so your votes for F and B. Okay, well, I was going to click through the next slide to show, but then that'll give away the actions and the tasks. So the objective for this FIP is actually C. The fishery will have explicit long and short-term objectives consistent with MSC's P1 and P2 by January 24. And so I think this is actually points out, I think, some of the where it can be difficult to determine between objectives and actions. So the two that were identified as the potential objective were actually actions that will help the fishery achieve that objective. So I'll just click through so you can see that C is the objective, with B and F being the actions, and then the remaining three being the tasks. And Amanda, you came up with this example. Did you have any additional comments that you wanted to share on this?
Yeah, so thanks, Jessie. And yeah, I think you're right. This highlights the difficulty in sort of determining what's an appropriate objective and what's better suited to an action. And we'll continue to talk through this in this presentation as we go along. But in my mind, or the way that I think about it anyway, is that it's best to sort of write the objectives in a way that pins them to an MSC performance indicator, the language within a performance indicator. And those of you who also work on full assessments will understand this also to be kind of the requirements for writing a condition in a full assessment, which is that the objective, in terms of the sort of the level, because I mean actions are also kind of objectives, but in terms of the level at which you determine what is what, I would say that you shouldn't write an objective that's any more granular than a single performance indicator level. So in this case, we've got C, which says the fishery will have explicit long and short-term objectives consistent with MSC's Principle 1 and 2 by January 2024. So for one thing, the one clue there is that it's the latest time frame in this whole list. But also, you may recognize that language to be very similar to one of the performance indicators in Principle 3, which asks for objectives consistent with MSC's Principle 1 and Principle 2. And then the two actions kind of break that down into Principle 1 related objectives, which would be Action B. So if you see explicit short and long-term objectives for sustainable stock management. So that's the Principle 1 aspect by January 2021. And then the second action is F, which says update that FMP to include ecosystem-related objectives by January 2023. And so that's the kind of Principle 2 part of the work. So developing this fishery management plan with those two distinct components would be two actions to achieve the objective of explicit short and long-term objectives consistent with P1 and P2. And you know, I realize we just kind of threw that. This is using these kinds of examples that are not directly what you're dealing with in your own FIPs makes this a little bit harder. But I guess the point was just to illustrate that as a rule of thumb in a way for defining objectives versus actions.
Amanda, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Could these two actions, B and F, be objectives for a basic FIP?
Yeah, so I mean, this is something that we've discussed a lot, and particularly between Jesse and I when we were coming up with this webinar, is that it's not really set in stone what is an objective or what is an action, what's appropriate for what, and it really just depends in some sense how granular you want to be. And in my experience, it's better to be more granular than less granular. But so that's a very good question, because if you had a basic FIP and that was the only thing that basic FIP was focused on was the fishery management plan, then it might make sense to have two objectives and have them focused on stock management and then ecosystem management. But if you've got a comprehensive FIP that has, you want to kind of avoid having 50 different FIP objectives.
Yeah.
You might decide to set those objectives a bit more high level. And so that's all I was suggesting, or we were suggesting with this, was that from the point of view of, maybe it's more from the point of view of a comprehensive FIP, and in any case, it really is up to the FIP implementer. But I guess the point is just to think about it, linking it to the PIs, and if you're having difficulty determining what you want your objectives to be versus your actions, that if you think about it at the level of the performance indicator, at the kind of most granular level for an objective, that is a good guide.
This
Thank
is
you.
Nicole. I think I definitely agree with the idea that the more granular that you can be, the more specific, it often ends up helping the actual work and then the ability to track that work in a FIP. But I am noticing on my end that even in the, or at least in the FIP template that is now kind of more standardized, the work plan template, I think the only real reference, it's not specified, like what is an objective, and it ends up often just being the actions with their corresponding tasks. So just notice that it does make sense. I like this kind of framing of here are the overarching objectives of the project. But just in my experience, often see the actions followed by kind of the tasks that define the actions, and rarely see the work plan laid out as clearly, maybe, or not as often, not rarely, but.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. That's a good point, and that was raised earlier too when we were looking at those work plan templates. That I think somebody raised it in the earlier webinar as well, that there's nowhere on those on that template for the objective to be stated even, and it goes into quite a lot of detail into each action, and so it almost assumes that that's the highest level of planning. And it's the issue too is, I think, in relation to the FisheryProgress interface, is that we see some FIPs that are very granular and very detailed, and they start out with a lot of actions, like you said, and then even more tasks. And then others that are way more high level, so they have one action that's like, we're going to meet the MSC standard by 2023 or whatever it is, and or one objective, and then you have to do a lot of digging into the associated documentation to actually find out what is the plan. And so I think there's a balance there as well to try to kind of make it for users of the FisheryProgress website a little bit more transparent on how to track progress, and provides some means of getting to meaningful progress tracking without having to go deep into documents. But on the other hand, you don't want things that are so giant and broad that you have to carry out 4 years worth of work to even make any progress on an action. And so we'll get to talking about that a bit more later. But yeah, it's not, I mean, it is, and I guess that's why this webinar has been developed by FisheryProgress because it isn't an exact science, and there is guidance, but there is always going to be some judgment associated with it depending on the context. Any other questions or points? Oh, go ahead.
Nope, I was just going to ask if there are any other questions before we move to the next slide. All right, I'll pass it over to you, Minda.
Okay, so yeah, we're swapping we're handing over the torch. And I'm going to lead the rest of these slides, but just like the previous set, and at any point, if you have a question or comment, please either interrupt or type into the chat box. So the next topic we're going to discuss is linking actions to performance indicators, and we had already touched on that a bit with the questions in the last set of slides. It's really critical in an effective work plan that the completion of an action has a direct impact on one or more performance indicators within the framework, because that is the benchmark against which progress is being tracked. And the expected impact should be explicit in the action plan. So, and here we put a little guide, so where possible, it should be explicit to the scoring issue level. So everyone should know that the platform, the MSC standard upon which these FIPs are based, has a number of performance indicators, but within a lot of those performance indicators are several different scoring issues, which are specific to different elements of that area of performance. And so it's very helpful if the actions can be pinned to the specific scoring issue, because that part of the standard is much more, I guess, much more specific, and it makes it easier to design an action plan around it. And then just a question for the group here. In my experience developing action plans and looking at action plans, it's usually the first performance indicators addressed in an action plan are the information indicators. Does anybody have any thoughts as to why that might be the case? Anyone? Okay, well, in the first webinar, we had the response that we had for this question was to do with, because it follows the logic of the MSC standard, I think is what was written at the time. And that pretty much answers it in a broad sense. And I guess this is, again, just a little bit of guidance in trying to break down what needs to be done to address gaps in a fishery or to improve the fishery. Oftentimes, those gaps are identified across the standard in a lot of different places, but many of those gaps are linked to a lack of information. So you may have like sub 60 score in your pre-assessment for information and for outcome and for management in a particular component. And if you develop the action plan to address the deficiencies in information first, then that oftentimes has knock-on effects in the other components of the assessment, because once you gather the data, then suddenly you understand a bit more about what the impact of the fishery is, for example, or what the status of the species is, or whatever it might be, and then that can improve the outcome for that indicator as well. So it just makes sense, and it also helps, I think, the FIP participants to maybe not get discouraged or not get overwhelmed when they get back a scoping document or a needs assessment or a pre-assessment that has tons of red marks all over it, and then they're like, well, where do we start? And everybody's sort of like, where do we start? It seems like a huge, big job, but just to think about starting with how can we improve the information basis to then slowly work on the other aspects. So here, this is just back to our example of linking. So our second column in our little example shows how the scoring issues, the PIs and scoring issues link to these particular 3 actions towards achieving the objective listed at the top. So we've got the actions linked to the scoring issue level. So the first two are impacting on scoring issue, performance indicator 2.3.3, scoring issue A, and that's the information indicator. And the third one, is having an impact on scoring issue, performance indicator 231, scoring issue B, and that's the outcome indicator. So that's really what is the impact of the UOA on ETP species, but we can't answer that question until we've developed the information sufficiently, which initially has an impact on scoring performance indicator 233. And again, I know that this might seem obvious, but the reason that I'm mentioning this, so kind of stressing this so much, is because the tendency can also be to try to go through the entire standard in order. And so we find this as well with our assessment team members, is that you try to do it in order, and the outcome indicator comes before the management indicator, which becomes before the information indicator in the chronology of the way the standard is written. And you don't have to think about it. I know that everybody knows this, but it's helpful to remind ourselves that we don't have to think about it in that order. And oftentimes it makes the most sense to think about it in the reverse order. All right, so on to responsible parties. This is the next sort of essential element of an effective work plan. And I think it's probably quite obvious why pinning down the responsible parties to a great level of detail is very important. So the responsible parties are organizations or people, or oftentimes people within organizations, who are responsible for completing each activity in an action plan. So back to our example, in our responsible parties column, you'll see that there are a number of responsible parties implicated in each of these actions. So there may be a temptation to just assign one responsible party for each action, but it's really beneficial, I think, in work planning and in actually ensuring or maximizing the chances of a successful work plan, to be very clear up front just who is going to have to be involved in each action, and to work on the plan in consultation with those parties that will be implicated within it. Jesse had made that point in the last webinar, that it's obviously a lot easier to get people to do actions within a work plan if they are involved in developing it, and sort of, rather than having something presented to them with yes, you're a fishery manager C, and you will be collecting and analyzing this data, but obviously having those parties involved all along the way. So always important to remember that for like operational actions, obviously you need fishermen to be involved, and for management type actions, it's important to have managers involved, and just to not be, I guess, not be hesitant to really be specific about the responsible parties. So here we've got a new example, a little example to go through in the group. We have 3 fictitious actions here that may exist in a work plan for a FIP, and we wanted to ask participants in the webinar to identify responsible parties, possible responsible parties for each of these actions. So let's start with the first one. First action is to codify existing fisheries management practices into a written fisheries management plan with explicit short and long-term sustainability objectives. Any thoughts as to who should be listed as responsible parties for this one? And feel free to type or to answer by voice.
Amanda, I have a question, maybe before the answer. Can they list responsible parties that are not part of the FIP, part of the MOU? Sometimes governments are reluctant to sign an agreement with any private party. So, and for some actions, for sure, you need the government. So that's where I'm asking.
Yeah, I think that it could be a bit of an iterative process. So you can list, and you should list, anybody who is needed in order to achieve an action. And if members of the government are needed to achieve an action, to implement something into regulation, for example, then they should definitely be listed. And then there might be a time within the work planning process where you sit back and you look at your responsible parties and you say, okay, well, all of these people are around the table here, but these others are not. How are we going to make sure that, how are we going to make sure that they, you know, are aware of and willing to participate in this work? And, you know, sometimes that can't be, like you said, that sometimes that can't be a formal agreement, but there should at least be a line of communication, I think, if you realistically expect something to occur.
Thank you.
So from the chat box, Eileen suggests that the FIP implementer might be a responsible party for this one. And John, I just put you on mute because of that loopback sound that we heard. I'm going to take you off, but I would ask that you mute yourself unless you have something that you'd like to say.
Sorry about that.
Oh. Okay, wake up. Okay, yeah, I think the FIP implementer is definitely an important responsible party. Eileen, do you have, would you mind saying a bit more about what within that first action you'd expect the FIP implementer to be doing?
I suppose from a sort of starting point that you'd have to actually gather together all the existing practices. So you'd have to speak with the various actors involved in the fishery, you know, obviously the fishermen and anyone else who might be involved. Like here, we'd probably discuss with the processors as well, and maybe any kind of the state bodies who would be assisting the fishermen to see what the practices are at the moment. And then just based on our own experience, we would then have to be the party that's involved in collating and codifying that to draft a document.
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds exactly what I would imagine to be the situation as well. So you'd have the FIP implementer sort of facilitating and organizing the process, but also other responsible parties would be fishermen and members of the industry who, you know, you'd have to interview or discuss with to determine what those practices are and get it all written down. Anyone else have any thoughts on that first action?
We have a question from Mara, and it's, does this mean responsible parties are not those that have agreed, but instead are the ones that are assumed as needed? Good question.
That is a good question. So my answer to that would be, I would hope that there are not too many cases where those are different people. So I would say, and in my experience, it's really difficult to develop a work plan that relies on parties that are needed that have not agreed, or at least not aware of the need for them in order to achieve that action. And so if you can't get those parties that are needed to achieve the action, then either, you know, probably you should think about redevising that action or the plan or the people involved that you expect to need to achieve it, because I mean, I think your chances of success are go down as, you know, you need people who aren't in agreement. And again, and it relates to Albert's question, in agreement doesn't necessarily mean having signed a paper that says, yes, I agree, but at least, you know, involved enough or notionally understanding what their role is and why.
Okay, thanks. It was building off of Albert's question that I was asking, because it felt like the answer there was that they don't have to necessarily sign. So it's really those who have verbally agreed, or there's some sort of commitment that has been given. and then they can, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, just to remember that it is, ultimately there's an accountability of anyone involved in the FIP, particularly I guess the FIP implementer and the, the sponsors of the industry or whoever is with the most interest in getting this FIP moving along on track, to make sure that, your action plan is achievable and has everyone's buy-in that it needs to be. You obviously can't guarantee that everybody's going to step up when needed, but yeah, so I think it's risky to assume that somebody is going to be needed and to not loop them in as early as possible. And that's also why I think it's particularly important to take this responsible parties aspect of the work planning very seriously at the outset. Okay, let's go through the second one. We just, in the interest of time, we'll just do one more on this and then move on. So the second one, the second sample action, implement electronic monitoring on vessels as a means of improving catch accounting. Who might be responsible parties involved in that action? Anyone?
Sure. I'll suggest the fishermen who need to install the electronic monitoring, maybe enforcement agencies if they're relevant for helping track the data.
Yep, that's right. So we had some other, so Mara, was that just you speaking?
Sorry, that was Jocelyn.
Oh, hey, Jocelyn, sorry.
Hey.
So Mara wrote in the text box, the chat box, enforcement branch, consultants or support team for tech vendor selection and implementation. I think that's all good. I think what Jocelyn said is also definitely important. Julie and Christoph both said industry partner or industry participant. Yes, also crucial. Yeah, so I think all of those answers are correct. So just I guess the point there was to make sure that with those sorts of actions that we think about all those levels of participation. So obviously you have to have industry support and cooperation to learn and to install or to service their own electronic monitoring equipment. You need a tech vendor. You need some sort of science involvement, I would think, to understand the way. So if the objective is for this EM system to improve catch counting, how is it deployed? What is it looking at? Who's going to be reading the tapes, et cetera. So yeah, so just there's quite a lot of responsible parties in an action like that. Okay, so unless there's any other questions on responsible parties, let's move on. Timeframes and deadlines. So this is another thing that's really important and sometimes missing from action plans. So it's important to have an estimate of the time frame needed to complete each activity and milestone. This example gives a date range. Oftentimes it's probably okay to have just a deadline rather than a time frame. Time frames can help those who are looking at the FIP to understand why certain deadlines might be well into the future, because actions are planned in sequence. And so something that looks like it should be able to be done quickly, it may in fact be able to be done quickly, but it isn't started for another 1.5 years or 2 years or something because it's further down the track. So it might have, let's say, a 3-month time frame, but its deadline is 3 years into the future. So I think there's some flexibility there. But the point is that it's very important to think about the timeframes and the deadlines, and to put one with each action. And if you're doing tasks, within an action, of course, the more specific you can be about the timeline for those tasks is the better. And then just the note that the timeframes for the actions should not extend beyond the projected end date for the FIP, which seems like it should be fairly obvious. So here, we just filled in the deadline column on our sample. And you see that the deadline is listed for the month and year for expected completion. And you also can see that these actions are sequential. So you can't do the second action before the first, and you can't do the third before the second. And so the deadlines are getting progressively further into the future. Alternatively, you could put, the start and end date as a time frame so that it's more explicit there, the deadline column. But I think either way is probably fine. So yeah, go ahead. Albert, did you want to say something? I was just going to suggest that Jesse could.
No, I just wanted to say that way at the same time, if you organize everything that way, you are going to be able to show action progress. So that is really good.
Yep.
Action progress over time, no waiting until the end of the FIP to get an action done. So that's what.
Yes, that's right. There is definitely an advantage in that sense to be sequential with the actions. And then moving on, so the idea of metrics and key performance indicators is of course important. I think Jesse described it earlier as an action goal. And I would say that an action goal is analogous to a performance indicator or a metric, something that lets project participants track progress. So obviously you have to have a goal where you're trying to get to in order to be able to see where you are in relation to that goal. So that's just a basic project management feature, which is, obviously important for this type of project as well. And in the way I like to think about it anyway is that you should associate your key performance indicators, metrics, action goals, or what have you, whatever you want to call them. You should associate them with the MSC scoring issue changes that are expected as a result of the completed action. So that, the MSC framework already has benchmarks embedded within it that are quite specific at the scoring issue level. So rather than inventing new action goals or coming up with something totally different, it just makes sense to pin it to an MSC scoring issue. So if it's below 60, maybe the action is expected to raise it up to a 60 as a goal or a metric. And then just a note on that, sometimes a completed action will not result in a change to a scoring issue or a PI. And I think it's important to note this because a lot of times, or sometimes there's a tendency to make really complicated actions or ones that involve a lot of work because FIP implementers or people who are drafting these are trying to fit in everything that's needed in order to improve a particular performance indicator score. But in terms of the actual efficacy of an action plan or the clarity of it, you don't necessarily have to, with every action, make a change to a score. And I think Jeremy had highlighted or mentioned in the last webinar that FisheryProgress does have the ability to show progress that occurs even if sort of there's no color change. And so maybe Jeremy or Albert, maybe you could speak to that here.
Well, in fact, the fact that you are going to see a percentage of action completed increasing is showing you that there is progress, even though you don't have a score change.
Right.
Yeah, and Amanda, I'll add to that. Just for clarification, there used to be a function on FisheryProgress where you could show an up arrow or a down arrow, as you're saying, without an actual color score change. It isn't something that we have been using very frequently as of late. I will say, though, we are in the process of developing a 0 to 60 set of scores for FisheryProgress, and when we have that come live, we're planning on also being able to demonstrate progress from 0 to 60, kind of using a similar model to up and down arrows.
Great, thanks. And so this just, back to our example, you see our first action. There's quite a lot of work involved in that first action, developing and implementing training, developing identification keys, etc. But because that's needed in order to then implement and start collecting the data, you still have to do it. But once that action is completed, you're still not going to achieve a 60 score on that indicator because you really actually need the information before you can raise the score. But I think, to think about actions in a discrete way, as discrete steps within a process, it makes sense to divide them up this way. So it would be a lot more difficult to report on action progress if, let's say, action 1 and 2 are all lumped into one thing, because it would just be, I think it would just be too much. And it's a lot easier for everybody who was planning and who was also doing this stuff to chop it up a bit more. Kind of like Nicole was saying, the more granular, the better. So don't be afraid to write actions that might not improve a scoring issue score, as long as they're sort of, getting you in the right direction. Okay, sorry, I was just looking to the chat box. I see Eileen just logged off. So, okay, so then I'll associated budget, again, an important aspect of the work planning process. The budget can be a separate document from the work plan, but you can also put associated costs and funding sources within the work plan. It sort of doesn't. It's up to you, I think, how you want to structure it. But the point here is that there should be a link to, there should be an understanding of costs and funding opportunities at the action level. And the time frame of the budget should match the time frame for the work plan. So there should be an understanding during the planning process of where the money is going to come from for each action and when it's going to be available relative to when that action is expected to be carried out and completed. And the budget, oftentimes, particularly for a comprehensive FIP with a lot of actions, the budget will come from, or the funding sources will be multifaceted. So there will be a lot of stakeholder groups contributing, and sometimes the contributions can be in kind as well. So if you have, if you're relying on universities, for example, or university students for research or analysis or data collection, that can be indicated in there, whereas you might not be getting money specifically. You might be getting access to a student, for example, who's doing this work as part of a degree program or something. So there's always that that aspect as well to bear in mind. Go ahead, Jesse. And this is an example FIP budget template, which is understandably difficult or impossible to read, but it's just to provide you with a sense of how you might develop a budget in terms of the sources being laid out separately, and when the money and how much money is coming from each of those, and associated with what activities or actions. I'm sure everybody has their way of developing a budget, but the point is, you could and should be, at least in your planning process, quite detailed, so it's clear from the outset what money is going to what actions. So all of this we've laid out is sort of ideal best case scenario. Everything is developed up front and everything runs along like clockwork, but obviously we all know that the best laid plans are often interrupted or waylaid or whatever because of contingencies that occur, and it's more the rule than the exception that there will be changes or contingencies that you'll have to deal with. So if a FIP does not achieve its actions in the work plan within a specified timeline, there's certain things that the FIP should do. The FIP should report the reasons why the deadlines were missed and should update the work plan to reflect the adjusted actions and deadlines. And we've just given a little example here on the next slide, which shows this happening. So we've got our first action, the crew training and the ID keys have been developed. Everyone's trained, everyone's got the keys, everyone's got their logbook sheets to fill in, and they're all working on them and filling them in. But, and they're all being submitted, but all these sheets are stacking up at the fisheries office because the fishery manager who was responsible for using this information and recording it and collecting it has gone off on maternity leave and hasn't been replaced. So this has a knock-on effect on all the future further actions. It's going to delay the achievement of this action, and then it will affect all the subsequent work plan deadlines. So an updated work plan has been produced, and I think Jeremy explained really well sort of what FisheryProgress would like to see when these sorts of things occur within FIPS.
Yeah, so what you have written there in red is a perfect example of what kind of information we like to see given in a progress update for an action. We definitely understand that work plans are bound to change over time, and we're just looking for some transparency in how things are going. So for action 2, that red text would be a great thing to put in the action description. And as it states, if it impacts future deadlines, we would like to see those updated in a work plan and re-uploaded, and that's really all that needs to be done.
Just in addition, I think it's really important to keep in mind that we review the FIP, we need this information, but at the same time, you have to inform the viewers of your FIP what is happening. So always keep that in mind. Whatever you're doing, someone is going to be reading and they need to understand what is happening.
Okay, thanks, guys. Anyone have any comments or questions on this eventuality that probably everybody will experience at some point in the FIPS that you're working on, or any anecdotes how you've dealt with course corrections on your FIPS? All right, nobody wants to talk. Okay, moving on. It's getting late.
All right, apologies, there's a little bit of a delay when I'm clicking through the slides. But the last thing we wanted to just remind everyone about is that there are a number of resources available to help in the development of your work plan in terms of templates available, as well as clarifying and defining what some of these terms are. So the FIP review guidelines themselves can be a really useful resource, which hopefully most of you are already using already. There's also a glossary on FisheryProgress, as well as the templates and some additional resources that are useful for the development of various documents that will help when you're starting out with a FIP. And then last but certainly not least is the FisheryProgress FIP review team. So Albert and Jeremy, I'm sure, are more than happy to help answer any questions that folks might have regarding your work plan. So I just wanted to walk through, in case you're not familiar with where these resources are, just to show you where they are on the FisheryProgress website. So there is a whole resources section. There are a couple here that are especially relevant for work plans. And so we have, again, those general resources, FIP templates, as well as the glossary of terms are all available on that main page. And under the general resources, there are a couple of different tools available. So for example, from the MSC, from SFP, from WWF, which can be really useful, again, in helping think through how these things can be developed. And then on the FIP templates page, there is a work plan template available. And we'll walk through what some of those data fields are as well. So this is just a copy of some of the information that's in that template, again, that's available on FisheryProgress. So a lot of this is consistent with the information that we walked through today. So you have the action number and name, the action goal, description, expected completion date, the priority level. So this isn't something that's a requirement within the FisheryProgress reporting, but can be useful when you're just planning for your own FIP implementation. Estimated cost, responsible parties, and which PIs will be addressed by the action. So using the template can be really useful because it also is aligned with, with the exception, I think, of the priority category and the estimated cost, the data fields that are part of your FisheryProgress reporting. So by having the contents of your work plan laid out, following this template, it should hopefully make it easier on the data entry side on FisheryProgress. And so we have just some examples filled in here for what these fields are. And with that, we're happy to take any additional questions that people might have.
Hi, this is Mara. Thank you guys. This has been really helpful in terms of understanding the different levels, especially sort of objectives versus action versus tasks. I think it sounds like it's a little bit of an art form in terms of trying to understand how to craft those, especially, strategically, like you're saying, in terms of being able, Jeremy, to report on fishery progress in a timely way, not having it be too burdensome, but also being able to show that progress. So I think that's something we'll be looking to examples. And so I was just wondering, on the resources section, are there other examples of, what you guys would consider, really well done action plans or work plans that we could look to as, getting a little bit more insight into that level of detail and kind of that balance?
FisheryProgress
Jeremy,
team,
Albert.
do you guys have a sense for that? I'm actually not sure if there are examples there.
Even if it's like from FIPs of the past, just wondering.
Hi, Margaret, popping in here. In the resources tab, there's a glossary section. And if you go to that, I know we have some examples of work plans and actions that we've kind of curated. So that can definitely give you some guidance on examples of what could be a good work plan and what could be good actions.
Excellent, thank you.
I believe there are also some examples of actions in one of the appendices of the FIP review guidelines as well. Any other questions or comments?
Well, Albert here. I have just a comment. I gotta leave now. Today I'm off and the rest of the week, but I couldn't miss this presentation, so that's why I'm here. Thanks a lot, Jesse and Amanda. This is wonderful, really useful. You did a terrific job, and please, if the audience has any question, please let us know. Thank you.
Thanks, Albert, and everyone. This is Amanda again. It's our pleasure to do this kind of thing, and so I think it's very good for FisheryProgress guys to involve members of the Technical Oversight Committee in this way, and we hope that this kind of thing is useful. And again, I know Jeremy and Albert offer to answer any questions and to get in touch. Equally for me, and I think also for Jesse. We welcome any questions that you may have on this sort of thing, and we'll try to help as we can.
Yeah, so it looks like if we don't have any more questions or comments, we'll be able to wrap up a few minutes early. And again, thank you to Amanda and Jesse, and thank you guys for joining in. And as we hope you found this webinar useful. And yeah, as everyone was saying, if you have any questions or feedback, obviously always feel free to reach out to us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.